We've come a long way in human development. Used to be you was old age if you were in your late 20s because you were going to die by your 30s on average. But now we've expanded our lifespan dramatically such that in our country and other industrialized countries, you might reasonably expect to live into your 70s or 80s. And that's unprecedented in human history. And it presents us with new challenges and new perspectives on development. Now, I'm going to give you this slide of genetic information, which you'll want to know for your test. We'll keep it pretty basic, but I want you to appreciate one thing in particular, and that is that when we talk about genetic information, we're talking about biology and we're talking about nature. That which is transmitted to you through heredity, right? A lot of people put a lot of stock in what they see in day-to-day life as being of heavy genetic influence. Well, your existence is of heavy genetic influence, right? We could take it to be assumed that you don't operate without genetic influence because here you are in a body full of genes in every cell that are replicating and doing their jobs, right? But you don't operate anywhere at any time that's not in an environment, right? And that would be called the nurture aspect. So when people talk about nature and nurture debate, they're talking about the relative influence of genetics and kind of inherent biological structures versus the influence of the environment in which those structures operate. And they are not mutually exclusive by any means. The way I see it, and I can give a little bit of evidence for my view, but my view might be disputed by other people in science, it seems to lean a little bit heavier towards the environment in terms of what you get as an outcome through development. But it is assumed that that is on top of a genetic influence that exists that brought you here to begin with. So genetic information, most people really don't understand genetics at all, and I'm not going to make you understand it at a level that I think is unreasonable. This is not a genetics class, but you better understand the basics for your test and for your life. When people start talking about testing DNA to see what kinds of potential problems you might encounter down the road, you want to make sure you understand what that means and what probabilities are. We've already talked a great deal about probabilities and what genotype is and what phenotype is. In other words, what's the genetic potential versus the actual outcome or manifestation out of the possibilities that you had. And we start off with the basic unit of genetic instruction being the gene. People talk about genes. But what are they talking about? Well, we're talking about short segments of chromosomes, right? Molecules of deoxyribonucleic acid, which people call DNA because that's an awful long word with lots of syllables, and DNA is much easier to remember, that hold the genetic instructions for every cell in our body. And if we produce offspring, whether you're the sperm or the egg in that equation, you're contributing half of all the genes that that person will have in their development and their ultimate life, assuming that they make it that far. And that can't always be assumed, as we'll see. So what is a chromosome? If I'm talking about short segments of a chromosome, well, it's a thread-like strand of DNA. DNA is in the nucleus of cells, and it carries the genes and the functions of heredity. It carries the blueprints or the programs that tell the cells of the organism you create what to do and when to do it. Because you start off in a pretty simple scenario. One sperm, one egg, two cells, union into one cell, that then divide into 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, on and on until you've got trillions of cells that differentiate themselves into every kind of tissue in your body. How do they know to do that? How do they know to become heart tissue versus bone versus neurons, right? Versus skin cells or eyelashes? Because it's all pre-programmed. It's being carried in the blueprint, which is what we're talking about, the DNA. Break it down, every cell, a normal human being, and when I say normal, I don't mean disparaging, I mean normal development. It would be abnormal statistically for you to have anything other than, right, 23 pairs of chromosomes, 46 total, half from the mother, half from the father. So if we got half coming from the mom and half coming from the dad, people like to read right into that right away. They see a baby and they go, look, it looks just like his dad. It looks just like the mom. And I look at all of them and go, it looks just like a baby. They all look like babies. Sometimes you can see the genetic influence, but what people want to see is a direct influence. And genetics is far more complicated than that. And to appreciate that, I had the good fortune to have the experience in this class previous semester of a woman coming up to me and saying, would you mind if I brought my daughter in and showed her to the class? I said, yeah, let me talk with you a bit more about that. And to look at her, she looked stereotypical African American. Dark skin, dark eyes, dark hair. Her daughter, who was her biological offspring, light skin, blue eyes, light hair, looked like stereotypical Caucasian. Now, what do you think she experienced in her life because people's naive views of genetics? When did you adopt your daughter? Now that's fascinating, because what are people saying to this woman? That can't be your kid. But it was her kid. Her kid was very cool. Her kid was about 10 years old. Her kid came in here. Her kid's name was Love. I said, Love, that is a beautiful name, girl. Are you okay with standing up in front of a bunch of people? Your mom's explaining it. She's like, yeah. And she got up here and people were just blown away, because their naive view of genetics was that you have to bear some resemblance genetically. I have a daughter I adopted. She's my daughter. Soulfully, legally, that's my daughter. And it was interesting because sometimes people would tell me that she looked like me in some way. And I'm like, that's fascinating. She is white, but she's about this tall, blue eyes and blonde hair, and a girl. So I don't know where beyond that it looks like she looks like me. Certainly it isn't due to genetics, because we don't share heritability, right? And I wound up having a biological child, not planned, but glad to have him, right? And I went to the hospital having seen all these 20/20 videos, you know, these news shows about going home with the wrong baby. And I wasn't going home with the wrong baby. So I took a Sharpie marker in my pocket. As soon as he came out, I was going to write doula on the bottom of his foot, so that I make sure that that one goes home with me. No diss on them other ones, but I want mine. I went through a lot to get this thing. My wife went through a lot more to get this thing. I want to make sure we get the right thing. And then he went through this emergency C-section procedure, and he came out screaming at the top of his lungs, 2 feet long. I think he'd been in the oven a little too long. 10 pounds, 4 ounces, with flaming red hair. I just kept the pen in my pocket. I'm like, I can pick that one out of a lineup. That one's going to be easy to take home right? Because it turns out about 1 in 46 Caucasians has red hair. He had fully developed hair, and it was weird looking, copper-like, metallic, shiny. It was bizarre. It's since darkened. And then all these people come up to him, and what do you tell your kids about strangers? Don't talk to strangers. But man, they're drawn to these little redheads. Now, some of them are mean to them. They are the victims of some prejudice. Sometimes it's slight and sometimes it's severe. Redheaded is just another way to be different, like sex or race or socioeconomics or religion, etc., etc., etc. And so the women come up and they're like, that's a gorgeous color of red hair. If I could get that in a bottle, I would use it all the time. And they would say, where did he get that red hair? Why do they say that? Because his mama did not have red hair, and I do not have red hair. And they think there's something weird about that. Now, he happened to bear a lot of resemblance to me, but when you have somebody question the parentage of your child, it's kind of insulting if you're inclined to be insulted. Me having the background, I was not inclined to be insulted. What I saw was people with naive ideas, right? Where did that red hair come from? It's a recessive gene. It has to be brought forth by the parent on both sides, right? So my ex-wife's grandfather had red hair, and my mom's first cousin has red hair. So it's present on both sides, but it's like a genetic crapshoot. It is totally random whether it winds up coming together at any given point to be expressed. And people just don't know that. So they come up to him and they're like, let me touch that red hair, right? And he's going, this is weird. Why people treat me like this? Well, think how it is for other people who have other distinguishing things that are just simple physical manifestations of a gene pool of which we're all members. Right? There's more about us that is similar than is different, but we make so much of our differences. Sometimes they're very important. Some of the differences we make out to be of ultra importance are sex differences. And I want to distinguish the word sex from the word gender. Sex, I want to use in a biological sense. In the biological sense I'm talking about pairs of chromosomes. 23rd pair of chromosome, that determines your sex. In a female, it's XX. Why X? Because the chromosome shape is like an X. Right? If it's XX, that means the father delivered an X chromosome and the mother delivered an X chromosome. Now, the mother can only contribute X chromosomes, right? Because she's XX. So in an egg, that's what's going to be contributed. So the sex is determined by the sperm. Because the man has XY, he could deliver either X or Y. Kind of randomly. In all of those millions of sperm that are involved in this process. Right? So you look at sex at the most basic level, and we're talking about a quarter of a chromosome difference. Out of 46. So we got the X-shaped chromosome for the male and a smaller Y-shaped chromosome for the male. So the Y chromosome leads to development of male through an interesting process, because it turns out that all of us are wired to be female. It takes an active process triggered by the Y chromosome to let forth hormones that create differentiation, the degeneration of the Mullerian system, which would be default female, and the promotion thereof of the Wolffian system, which brings about male reproductive capacity and organs. So in a lot of ways, we're really exactly the same except for this thing that allows us to procreate and make more of us. And then we make a lot out of that thing such that we think that any kind of behaviors we see by most females or most males must be because they're males or they're females. So the behaviors that they engage in as a male biological or as a female biological, we take to be in some sense biologically preordained, but it usually isn't. And that's gender expression, gender role. So I might be XX, female biological, but feel like I identify more with masculine sense of self or sexuality. Or conversely, BXY, genetic male, sex, but feel inclined to identify either in behavior or in sexuality with a more feminine gender expression. And that, for many people, is a real conflict. It's not a lot of people, which is why it's only now coming to the forefront as an issue, but they're people, nonetheless. Human beings, dignity, pride, a sense of self, worth, matter. And when people start throwing labels around with misunderstandings of what genetics mean versus what gender means, right? They start labeling people and making expectations on them that sometimes are hard to live up to. And it turns out that all the things we thought, boys are boys, you know, that's just what boys do. And girls are girls. Sugar and spice and everything nice. They can't do certain things. They can't be aggressive. Well, Albert Bandura showed that they can be aggressive. Now we got girl hockey teams. Girls didn't play hockey in the 1950s. Nobody in the world thought that the girl could play hockey. Right? That's an aggressive male sport. Girls can't do that. Well, it turns out if the societies in which they are brought up, biologically female, think that they cannot, they will treat them in ways that promote them not doing that. The very few that might attempt it won't have much training or support in doing it. They won't do very well at it, which will then be taken as evidence that, see, told you they couldn't do it. But But when they are brought up believing they can do it, and they're supported in doing it and get training in doing it, whatever it is that we used to think only males can do, it turns out females have been able to do everything that males have been able to do. The only real biological differences that we see, and there are many in terms of hormones, right? And I always say here to the females, thank you. Thank you very much, because I'm a male, and I don't ovulate, and I don't menstruate, and I cannot imagine what it would be like once a month to have large quantities of biological material coming out of my penis. It sounds terrible. I know a lot of women. I know that they go through a lot. The hormonal ups and downs, not to mention the loss of the blood, not to mention the inconvenience of that, trying to function as just a person doing what you normally do from day to day, and then to bear the burden of fertilized egg carrying, full term, and then delivery. Thank you. And if any guy ever tells you anything about your period other than what can I do to help you, you tell him to shut the hell up. Oh God, she's on a rag. You don't have a concept of what's on a rag, and neither do I. So let's be honest. That is what makes our species exist, and we owe a debt of gratitude and understanding as males to the females who bear that burden of continuing our species. But beyond the reproductive portions of what it is to be male and female biologically, most of what other kinds of things we assume go with that are expressions of gender expectations by particular societies. When societies do them for eons, they'd certainly look like they're biologically driven differences. But it's amazing how human beings can adapt to different environments and different circumstances if given opportunities to do so. So when the patriarchal dominance ceases and women are treated as equals, I like that little quote, feminism is the radical notion that women are people too. Right? We've had a long, long history of male dominance. Not because it was biologically predestined, but because it's what happened in societies, and it was generated generation after generation after generation, reinforced over and over again. And we've seen only in the last 50 years a dissolution of that in some countries. And with that dissolution of those rigid expectations, we've seen what we think to be biological gender expressions change radically. And it opens up new possibilities for humans to be human. So that's an important point, I think, to take home. Here's an actual picture of DNA. That's a tiny little thing right there. I just thought that's worth looking at. They finally did it. Because before, it took them forever just to figure out what this double helix was. They didn't even know, right? You remember Gregor Mendel and his little peas? Crossbreeding peas, and he has this general idea that maybe the parentage of peas has something to do with the offspring of peas, and if you manipulate it carefully and scientifically, you can start to unravel the mystery, and they finally unravel the mystery that it's this sperm cell in the semen and this egg that is being ovulated, right, that connect together and share elements to create a unique DNA structure that reflects the entire genetic history of both parents and has a random crapshoot kind of a outcome potential where you get things you're like, they don't look anything like their parents. They may not. They look a lot like their parents. They might. Both are possibilities, but they're kind of random possibilities. You've seen siblings that don't really look a lot like each other that come from the same set of parents, right? And you've seen identical twins that look identical to each other, right? The possibilities are not endless, but they're pretty wide. And so you're looking inside the cell, you see the nucleus, and we see the chromosome, and we see that's just a big old bunch of this old strand here, the telomeres, we cap that off, and what we got is our double helix with alternating pairs of particular proteins, and that's what it looks like if you can get a picture of it. And that's what makes us biologically. But a lot of what we make of that biology is actually psychological and sociological. And we make so much of it that we assume it's biological, and that's not always the case.